Good morning. Welcome to Sunway University. There is perhaps no greater symbolism than today that on a holiday for a Hindu festival, we have a talk on is political Islam a threat to democracy. I think we're all here because we agree that this is an exceedingly important topic for the world, especially after the Arab Spring, and a very important topic for Malaysia. We are very lucky to have an extremely astute, original thinker on this topic, Mr. Mustafa Akyol. We will certainly give him a hard time because he will ask lots of questions, as it would be normal for Malaysian audience. Because when we think of democracy, we think of the rule by the majority opinion. And that is this well-known possible defect of rule by the majority opinion, which is called the tyranny of the majority, where the majority uses the legislative process to restrict the rights of the minority opinion. In the case of Europe, it will be the Christians restricting the rights of the Jews. This is why Farid Zakaria, another person in your trade, has emphasized the importance of liberal democracy, where the majority restricts itself from imposing, from trampling on the rights of the minority. So we all know that many times when the majority restricts the right of the minorities, it usually does it in the name of protecting the right of the majority. For example, when we restrict the flow of information to Muslims in Malaysia, we do it in the name of protecting them from false information. Like, for example, one of Farouk's favorite example is the origin of species is freely circulated in Malaysia, but the Bahasa Malaysia translation of the origin of species is banned. Perhaps it could confuse a group that is somehow seem more vulnerable to being confused than other groups. And of course, the latest invention of protecting the majority would be the introduction of halal shopping cart and non-halal shopping cart. I presume the next thing we will see will be the introduction of halal money and non-halal money, which would make it very hard to do business between different groups. So, Mr. Akyol, we really look forward to what you have to say. Please.
Thank you so much. And first, apologies. It took a little time to come here this morning, and I kept you waiting here. And really sorry for that. That was a complication in the organization this morning. And I did not know that this was a Hindu festival, so congratulations. I mean, among the Hindu friends hear us. There are a lot of interesting things going on in Malaysia. There's a Chinese New Year, a Hindu festival, and of course Islamic practices. It's great actually to see that diversity. But how to manage that diversity is a question for, I think, all pluralistic societies, and I hope it will be more and more managed within a pluralism based on equality, all traditions. Well, while I was just listening to this dear academic friend of ours who kindly introduced me, and many thanks for the kind introduction as well, I thought of an episode. First of all, on the issue of Charles Darwin and the origin of species. I hear that books like that are sometimes banned in Malaysia, or words like Allah are banned as well, because it will confuse Muslims. I wonder why we Muslims don't confuse other people, but always other people confuse us. And I wonder how would we feel if certain concepts from our tradition would be banned in Christian majority countries. Why if, for example, in a Christian majority country, a Christian government banned Muslims from uttering the word Jesus because it could confuse Christians? We wouldn't probably feel very happy about that, and I think that's a good thing to consider about all this confusion matter. Plus, what we gain when we ban certain books, when we make especially people from the native language, from reading those books, we are not achieving anything other than making our societies less informed about the world. And I think a faith is stronger when it is more informed, not less informed. So I think that's a reason to look at all these issues. I'm not saying this to, offend authorities. I have respect for Malaysia's laws and customs, but just here are some perspectives I think to share. Now I'll come to the topic of, is political Islam a threat to democracy? It can be a threat to democracy, especially liberal democracy, and I'll come to the reasons in a bit. But let me share a few thoughts even on a broader topic, if you will, before even coming to that. The broader topic of the state of the Muslim world. Now, I'm a Muslim and I'm proud of my faith. But I will admit, there are many things in the Muslim world today which doesn't make me proud. You can see it on the news all the day. I mean, every day. You can see a group supposedly calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, killing people in the name of Islam, torturing people, and even establishing slavery in the name of Islam in the middle of the Middle East. That is a very marginal phenomenon, but it speaks in the name of Islam in a very distorted interpretation, as we mostly see. There was another group of Al-Qaeda attacking innocent civilians, calling it jihad. Al-Qaeda looks more moderate these days when compared to ISIS, but I hope ISIS will not look more moderate compared to something which is coming. But these are, of course, marginal groups, very marginal. That's why we call them extremists, and they represent a really very, very tiny minority. But then, even when you look at the so-called mainstream, there are things that doesn't make me proud. There's not terrorism, again, a marginal phenomenon, but there's a general authoritarianism problem that I see in the Islamic world. And that's the issue that I'm mostly thinking and writing about. It was just on the news yesterday that the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia banned or gave a fatwa arguing that chess should be banned because it makes people lose their time with nonsense. As if people are not losing their time with a lot of nonsense every day in the Muslim world or elsewhere. And of course, that doesn't appreciate the kind of rationality that chess nurtures, by the way, and maybe. And another Shia cleric agreed by him on that, by the way. So we had a consensus, a Sunni Shia consensus, rarely found on banning chess. There are other cases, when a Muslim decides to leave his faith and adopt another faith, an act which is called apostasy, which in my view wouldn't make me happy, but it's a matter of religious freedom. Some governments think that this is a crime, and they put those people on trial. They can be given death penalty in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sudan, Afghanistan, a couple of countries. And I know in Malaysia it's a complicated issue too, so you know the details more than me. This idea that Islam should be imposed by governments, by religious police, very widespread. And as a Muslim, I'm not happy with that authoritarianism for two reasons. Authoritarianism is not a good thing, and I think Islam should not manifest itself with that. Plus, I don't think authoritarianism in the name of religion makes people more religious. It makes them actually hypocritical. You see that in countries like Saudi Arabia. I mean, I've given this example a few times again this week, but it's, I think, representative. You go to Saudi Arabia, every woman wears a veil and niqab or hijab. You take a flight from Saudi Arabia, you come to Istanbul, and you see a lot of those ladies throwing that out and, you know, going to bars with miniskirts, which is their right. I'm not questioning that, but apparently that authoritarianism doesn't nurture a genuine conservative piety as it's what the authorities want. It rather breeds some kind of hypocrisy. Plus, what are we Muslims contributing to the world? How many inventions do we have? Are we producing great thoughts, great books that shock the world and, you know, change minds? Darwin wrote Origin of Species, a book that, you know, I've read, and, you know, I have certain takes on evolutionary theory. You can agree or disagree with it or interpret it in different ways. Do we have Muslim scientists who have written similarly impressive books that really open new paradigms in the world? Look at our universities. Do we have great universities that people want to come and study? We have Sunway, you know, I'll give that. We have some good universities in our, of course, Muslim world, but still, the top universities are not in the capitals of Muslim majority countries. It's Harvard, it's Oxford, it's this, it's that. So by looking at all this, some people in the world these days are saying, maybe there is a problem with Islam itself. Maybe this religion inherently suppresses reason, inherently breeds fanaticism, violence, terrorism. So they look at Islam, they look at the Muslim world and its troubles of today, and they extrapolate from that, saying that Islam might be a little bit troubling religion. Those people are sometimes called Islamophobes. They're afraid of Islam and Muslims. And what they want to do, they want to ban Islam. You know, they want to expel Muslims from America, as one interesting politician these days in the United States is arguing. Now, I agree we have a lot of problems in the Muslim world today, but I don't agree with those peoples, the people that we call Islamophobes. And, well, I will not agree with them because I'm subjective, I'm Muslim, you can say that, of course, I wouldn't agree with them. But there's an objective reason as well not to agree with them. And that is, while Islam actually created, nurtured a brilliant, productive, tolerant, enlightened civilization in its initial centuries. I said today the best universities are in New York, Oxford, Cambridge, you know, Washington, wherever, Boston, you know, the Western capitals. There was a time the best universities in the world were in Baghdad, Alexandria, Cordoba, Damascus, Istanbul. You know, Muslim world was the leading civilization in science and philosophy. There was a time that Christians were the illiberal, authoritarian, fanatic part and arguably the civilization of the world. Generally, Christians forget that, but it's good to remember that Christianity had a very scary past. It had its own ISIS of many sorts. I recall this in a trip to Italy a few years ago. With my wife, we had a time in Rome and Tuscany and the beautiful cities, little towns of Italy. One day we saw a torture museum. This was a device showing different machines made in the Dark Ages to torture people in very horrible ways. And those machines were used by the church, the Inquisition, to torture the heretics for their own sake. They were even more violent than ISIS, let me tell you. Well, Christianity got over that past through reform, enlightenment, a lot of effort, and a lot of trials. But at that time, when really the Christian Europe, the Catholic mainly Europe, was not a very brilliant part of the world. The Islamic world, as I said, was the advanced part. And all the major scientific discoveries were coming from the Muslim world. Ibn Sina, was the pioneer of medicine. Farabi was the pioneer of political thought. He was the one who translated Aristotle and the greatest commentator on Aristotle. But Aristotle was banned, in the Catholic Church in Europe. Muslims invented many concepts that made their way into the English language with words that are actually rooted in Arabic. Algebra comes from al-Jabir, Arabic. Algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi, Muslim mathematician. There is a whole list of alembic, admiral, alco, muslin, nadir, tariff. A lot of words in English had Arabic roots because Arabs were producing these concepts. There is Arabic numerals, which came into English from the Arab world. And at that time, by the way, Christians were horrified that some Christians are being fascinated by Muslims and their attractive culture. They were trying to ban it. There is a great letter written by a Catholic priest in the 9th century. It's in my book. It's a good read, by the way, if you want to. He says, all the Christian youth, it was a letter in Spain. In Spain, especially, Muslims had this brilliant, civilization based on Cordoba and Seville and great architecture and libraries and so on and so forth. And he said, all the Christians are now learning Arabic. They want Arab books and poetry. Nobody's reading Latin and they forgot the Bible. It sounds exactly very familiar today to our scholars who say our youth is, all in this Western culture. They all want to speak English. They're learning. So there was a time that Islam was a more brilliant and tolerant and pluralistic civilization. Anti-Semitism was a European problem, not an Islamic problem. Jews who were persecuted in Europe for being killers of God, implying Christ, they came to Islamic world in general to find safe haven. When they were persecuted in Spain in the 15th century, during the time of Christopher Columbus, because they had to convert to Christianity or leave Spain or die, they came to Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans said, you're welcome. That's why we have a strong Jewish community in Istanbul that still speaks Sephardim, Latino, the language coming from Spain. So there was a time that we really could look at the world and say, we are proud of our faith in the sense of its manifestation in the world. It's a more pluralistic, enlightened, creative civilization. And that's why looking at the problems of the Muslim world today and extrapolating to Islam as a civilization, as a religion, is a false analogy. That's why the people who generally do that are either ignorant or have some political reasons to do that, to create fear in the West and surf on that and to get elected, God forbid, as a new U.S. president or something. But we should leave that argument aside. But we should think, why are we in this crisis as Muslims today? What are the solutions? And what are the wrong solutions? Well, we are in this crisis in the past 2 centuries because something happened. This brilliant, productive Islamic civilization, which would get all the Nobel Prizes 1,000 years ago, as an American historian once said, if there were Nobel Prizes 1,000 years ago, Muslims would take all of it. That's by Martin Kramer, an American Jewish historian. That civilization began to stagnate after the 12th, 13th century. Why it began to stagnate? There are a lot of reasons. I explain them in the book. A lot of theories on this. It's a huge topic. But to sum up, basically Muslims thought that they have figured out everything. They're the leading civilization. They don't want to learn anything from anybody else. And they started to do new investigations, new thoughts. They just started repeating the old. Certain schools of thought, by the way, within the Islamic world, that was more dogmatic, more closed-minded, they dominated over the more rational, pluralistic schools of thought. That's why, basically, after the 13th century, no new idea emerges in the Muslim world for centuries. At the time, however, when Islamic world was stagnating, something was happening in Europe. Europe was gradually opening up, questioning its dogmas, ultimately reform, which was a troubled era, actually. But then came enlightenment and rationality and scientific developments, and the whole modernity flourished. And this modern European civilization came into the world scene. And let me tell you, not just Muslims, but every civilization was caught off guard to modern Europe. And modern Europe had great ideas like democracy, liberalism, equality, liberté, égalité, fraternité, all these great concepts. But also it came as a colonial, exploiting power as well. So Muslims suddenly faced that, oh my God, these Europeans are powerful and they have better armies and machines, and now they're coming to occupy our countries. The Ottomans realized this first because they were next to Europe. They realized that these Europeans know something now. The Europeans, which for centuries they regarded the barbaric unbelievers who had no idea. We know everything. That was the concept. In the 17th, actually the 18th century, the Ottomans started to realize they know something. That's why in the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire began its effort for reform, which would culminate in the 19th century big reform era called the Tanzimat, which is, I think, very important from an Islamic point of view. And they would try to adopt, and they sent emissaries to Europe, try to observe and bring some European teachers, and first about sciences and medicine and so on and so forth, but a lot of modern institutions came later. But it was never possible to catch up. We learn a little bit from them, but they do something more. Then, the more this Western civilization dominated, a reactionary force emerged in the Muslim world. This reactionary force, which in my view is the root of what we call Islamism, political Islam, basically said why we are weak, why we are being defeated, why we are being colonized, why we lost our glory. They said the only reason is that we deviated from our medieval classical norms. We should just revitalize our classical age. So they didn't understand exactly what the problem is. They thought the problem is that we're not religious enough. We are being influenced by the modern West. That influence is our problem. So we should create a political movement to revitalize our tradition in the sense of basically putting us back to the 7th century, or 8th or 9th century. And I'm really speaking in a great summary here, but the idea they said, for example, let's just revive the caliphate as it was. Let's just go back to implement the Shari'a as it was. Even let's thresh out all the adaptations and reforms and so on and so forth. And that will save us. That was one response. This was authoritarian Islamism. There was another response, which I called authoritarian secularism. And it said, religion is our problem. Let's get rid of religion. Let's ban hijab. Let's make women not wear the headscarf. Let's open our mind by bans with that, like that. Let's ban Islamic tradition. Let's ban madrasas. Let's ban books, and let's destroy Islamic civil society. That led to a very aggressive secularism. In Iran in 1925, the Shah came and he wanted to imitate the West, and he said the hijab, the headscarf, in all Iran will be banned. Police started tearing veil of women in the streets of Tehran in 1920s. That led to a reaction against the Shah's regime, which ultimately would culminate in the Iranian Revolution. And of course, when Ayatollah Khomeini led the Iranian Revolution and he created the Islamic Republic, he said, now all women will wear the hijab. The Shah said no woman will wear the hijab. Khomeini said, no, all of you will wear it now. So it was this kind of two authoritarianisms struggling with each other. Bashar Assad versus the Islamists, or Saddam Hussein versus the Islamists of Iraq. And now Sisi and, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So similarly authoritarian concepts struggling with each other, which never left enough room for a middle ground. And that middle ground, in my view, would be to say, we Muslims have a great tradition, but it was great for its own age. We have to re-understand and reinterpret it in the light of the modern age. And we don't have to abandon our religion. We can be and we should be true to our values, our faith. But we shouldn't use any authoritarian concepts. We should understand that the Western success is based on freedom more than anything else. So we should make freedom the basis of our political program. That approach, which I call Muslim liberalism or Islamic liberalism, actually was suggested by some people. In the late Ottoman Empire, there was this people called Young Ottomans. The most important name was Namık Kemal, whom I quoted in my book. And his dream was to bring a constitutional monarchy, a liberal democracy to Ottoman Empire. And he succeeded to some extent with the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. And to reform Islamic law, to bring education for women, equality for all religions, musawat as it was called. And he said this is not a betrayal of Islam, it's just a rediscovery of the fundamental values of Islam. So there was this kind of line. But that line often got suppressed by the authoritarian secularists or the authoritarian Islamists and the vicious cycle between them. Those of who are well versed in Jewish or Christian history and New Testament history, let's say, can see this dichotomy with the great example Arnold Toynbee gave. He likened the Muslim world of the modern era to the age of Jesus, to the situation of Jews in the age of Jesus. What do I mean by that? Well, in just a summary. Jews at the time of Jesus were a monotheistic nation dominated by Rome, a foreign civilization, a pagan foreign civilization. And that Roman domination had given different reactions, had caused different reactions. There were the Herodians, the Herod and his people who collaborated with Rome, who were fascinated by Hellenistic culture. They became betrayers of their own tradition. And then there were the Zealots, who said, we will fight Rome, we will fight the Herod and their people. So these kind of two vicious cycles that dominated Jewish thought in the first century. It was Jesus, I think, who gave a great message, who said, the kingdom of God is in you, and he neither fought Rome as a militant, or he didn't buy into this very zealotry, of the fanatics, and he just showed a more enlightened spiritual way, I think, to the Jewish people. A message which later went to the Gentiles and became the base of what we know as Christianity today. Anyway, that's a historical analogy that is, I think, interesting to see the historical parallels today. Now, that's why today, I would say we have a struggle ahead as Muslims. And it's a struggle with many dimensions. We want to be true to our faith. We want to understand the modern world today. We don't want to buy into just this pure love affair with Western modernity and imitating in every sense. But we can't live as if we were living in the modern age. How do we do this? How will we do that? Well, one thing I would say is that let's go back to the Quran. Because the very basis of our faith is the Quran. And when we look at the Quran in today's perspective, we will see that a lot of things in our religion is not in the Quran. The Quran gave a basis on which a whole Islam flourished, but a lot of elements entered into religion in the post-Quranic era, which are troubling. Here are a few examples. You know, women's rights is not great in some Muslim majority countries. Women don't have full equality. Women are sometimes seen as second-class citizens. Women can't even drive, you know, in Saudi Arabia. A lot of things are going on. Is this coming from the Quran? Is this coming from other sources? Here's one example. One of the most horrible examples of the suppression of women in the Muslim world is this practice called female genital mutilation. I don't know it is anything present in Malaysia, but if you go to Egypt, Sudan, Northeast Africa mainly, you will see that many women suffer this female genital mutilation. And the people who do this generally are Muslims, and they think this is what God told us to do. But when you look into it, it has nothing to do with Islam. It's a practice that predated Islam. It's a practice actually which is widespread not among just the Muslims, but also the Christians and even Jews of the same region. Ethiopian Christians for a long time practiced female genital mutilation. And it has nothing to do with the Quran. It's actually against the Quran, which says, you know, God's creation should not be altered. But Muslims who do this think it's the Islamic thing to do because it's written in some fiqh book, which is published in that, which is written in that geography at some century. But when you go back to the Quran, you don't find that. When you go back to the Quran, there is nothing which says apostates should be punished. Quran says religion is based on free choice. Let there be no compulsion in religion. A very famous verse states, I'm saying famous because oft quoted verse in Surah Al-Baqarah states, let there be no compulsion in religion. Muslims find ways to get beyond, you know, around that verse, saying there's no compulsion while entering religion. Once you enter, you know, you can't get out. And, you know, the Quran doesn't say that. Some interpretation which was written, you know, in medieval era according to the concepts of the time say that. So by simply going back to our scripture and reading it again and understanding that Shari'a is rooted in the Quran, but it includes so many man-made interpretations and layers and traditions and so on and so forth, we can first have a vision that gives us much more room for thought. That's one thing. Then we can also understand, re-understand what religion is about. Is religion something that will be imposed onto us by some authority? Will we fast in Ramadan? Because if we don't fast, some police can see us and take us to a police station? Is this a kind of social control mechanism? No. Religion starts with a very simple, fundamental thing. Belief in God, belief in your Creator. And religion starts with the path to have that bond with your Creator, to win His love, win His consent, and to follow His rules and regulations, and pray to Him and be thankful to Him, because you believe in Him. Now, when we replace that bond with God with some authority, which will guide us and police us, we are killing the very notion of religion. We are turning this into a political system. And an authoritarian political system, which I say generally makes people not religious but hypocritical. Now, that brings to our question. I mean, I took a lot of time to come to the question, but is political Islam a threat to democracy? Political Islam is a vague term, and it has different meanings. And I think we should not think that all parties, movements that fall into this category of political Islam are the same. Political Islam can basically mean a political action inspired by Islam. And it can be authoritarian, it can be violent, it can be more reasonable, it can be more lenient. And today, for example, there are, I think, on the more liberal and lenient and more moderate edge of the spectrum. For example, there is a Nakhta party in Tunisia, called Renaissance Party. It's an Islamist party by most definitions, but it's a party that has really played a very constructive role in the growing democracy in Tunisia. Its leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, is an, I think, enlightened thinker who said Islam cannot be imposed on people. Accepting or leaving Islam, that's a matter of your choice. He resisted, some of the people in his party who wanted to have Sharia law, in Tunisia. Then that approach allowed the Tunisian Islamist party Nakhta to make build a consensus with the secular groups in Tunisia, which allowed a very actually liberal constitution to be drafted in 2014. So political Islam is a great spectrum in that sense. But when you look at the mainstream and the more hardcore elements, you generally see political Islam as an effort to build an Islamic State. The term Islamic State became notorious, thanks to ISIS. But the original idea of political Islam is generally, we want Islamic State. There are many problems with that, because we are living in pluralistic societies, and not everybody wants to live under an Islamic State. Why? Because they might not be Muslims in the first place. They don't have to. Second, even if they're Muslims, they don't have to understand Islam in the sense that the Islamists understand. They can be from a different sect of Islam. They can be coming from a different interpretation of Islam. Imagine the Islamic State in Iran. It's a Shiite state. Why would, as a Sunni, I, want to live under a Islamic State, which is actually a Shiite state, which interpretation of Islam I respect, but I don't share? I wouldn't want to live in Saudi Arabia, let alone ISIS, or well, people can still follow Sharia based on their own conviction in a civil sphere, like in England. In England, there are voluntary Sharia courts. If Muslims are, willing to follow these courts based on family inheritance and so on and so forth, they can still go to the council of these institutions, which I think is a liberal solution to these traditions. Like the Orthodox Jews can live in, according to their traditions, in liberal societies, and they have these similar institutions. But once you say, I'm creating an Islamic State, you are actually combining your understanding of Islam with the modern state, which is an institution that didn't exist in the pre-modern era. And you're basically creating an authoritarian structure. I'm saying modern state did not exist in the pre-modern era, and I think that's an important point. The modern state is much more organized and much more controlling than any other institution in world history. In the past, states did not have national education. Education was something of civil society. Now states have education. They take your kid to the school at the age of 7. So what is the nature of that education? It should be Islamic. What if everybody doesn't want the Islamic education? What if everybody doesn't want your Islamic education? So in that sense, we need secularity, not because we abandon Islam, but because we have to respect differences, different interpretations, different ways of life, different traditions in society. So political Islamists, if their struggle is to make the state more Islamic, they are incompatible with liberal democracy. And we see that tension generally in the Arab world, even in Turkey these days to some extent, which is much more advanced, when you look at its discussions compared to some of the issues in the Arab world. But there is this tendency. Political Islamists, and the best representative of political Islam is who? The Ikhwan Muslimin in Egypt, which these days are being oppressed by a tyrant named Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, and I'm with them in the face of that tyranny, I should say that. But I have criticisms to their ideology and their political program. political Islamists like Muslim Brotherhood, for a long time, actually denied democracy. They said democracy is kufr. What's kufr? Infidelity. Like, it's a Western creation. We don't want democracy. Democracy is the rule by the people. We want rule by God. As if God will come down to earth and rule us. Rule by God generally means that somebody will rule in the name of God, by using his name and authority. But generally, political Islamists were not very warm to democracy. But after the 80s, in the Islamist universe, a new approach emerged. They said, democracy is not bad. Because why? Democracy means if you get elections, you come to power, we have some following in society, we can win elections, so let's come to power. So that's why gradually mainstream Islamist groups, and I'm separating them from the jihadis, which are armed groups. They're different. Mainstream Islamists, non-violent Islamists. Muslim Brotherhood is the best example again. Even in Algeria, there was another group, FIS, Islamic Salvation Front. They said, let's enter democracy, let's come to power. So in that sense, that was a good step. But in their idea, once you come to power with vote, then you can bring laws to Islamize a society. You can make hijab, compulsory. You can ban alcohol for everybody. You can regulate society. You can bring education to your standards and everything you want. So they embraced democracy of sorts by elections, but they did not embrace liberal democracy. That's why today, in the Arab world today, when you go there, you will generally see a tension between people who defend liberal principles and people who defend merely electoral democracy. In Egypt, you could see this tension. This is not a reason to justify military coups against Islamists, but also we should see the tension here. And we should understand that if democracy means somebody will come to power through majority and then use the state power to impose their ideal on society, that is not an admirable political model. That's not democracy as it's developed in the West. That's not a democracy that respects people's choices and definitions and different ways of life. That's not a democracy that will bring peace and harmony and freedom to our societies. In that sense, is political Islam a threat to democracy? If democracy means liberal democracy, yes, generally political Islam is a threat to liberal democracy. Is there a way out from this conundrum? Well, one way out is to have a reformed political Islam, like Nahda seems to be doing in Tunisia, which will articulate political Islam in a much more liberal way, and which will say, by political Islam, we understand that Islam has certain values, such as justice, pluralism, respect for rights, equality. These are the Islamic values, so we are in politics to defend these values. That would be a actually good political program. And I see that inclination in Nahda, and I want to give credit to that. But if political Islam means that we will come and we will establish Shari'a, thank you, but not everybody wants to live that way. Not everybody understands Shari'a in your way. Not everybody wants to accept Shari'a as their way of life. Shari'a should be a matter of voluntary practice. I follow Shari'a when I fast in Ramadan. Nobody tells me to do that. Shari'a is your practice. It's your way of life. And Muslims should be able to follow it by their own conviction. And from the state, what we need is not an imposition of Islam. From the state, what we need is, as Said Nursi, a great Turkish Kurdish scholar that I admired a lot, he said, what we need from the state is not religion, but it's freedom. Let the state give us our freedom, we will follow our own religion. And if we don't, it's between us and God. Thank you so much for your attention. So I spoke a lot. Thank you for your attention again. And I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah. I think there'll be lots of questions. Why don't we take 2 questions or 3 at a bunch?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, please raise your hand. There are mics on the side. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Oh, the mic is coming to you.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa Akyol. I have a question. You mentioned something about when the Muslims themselves want, even in, like say in England, where they want to create a Shari'a council to govern their family law and inheritance. But I see a problem also in that, because the issues that you mentioned, as in political Islam that does not respect freedom of human beings, this Sharia Council, what we've listened to the articles or the research being done by lawyers in England themselves, are that they are not respecting even basic women's rights. For example, cases of domestic violence, they will always advise the wives to forgive the husband and go back, not to issue police reports, which is recognized legally in England. So Sharia Council is okay if the Muslims are allowed to have such freedom as Muslims, let's say in Malaysia, where they're not given such rights as well. So it's almost basically the same thing. What Muslims in Malaysia want, as in freedom, equality, that they're not getting in the laws, Sharia councils in England are doing the same thing.
Thank you. Good point. We'll take a few more questions.
Yeah, one. Yes, that's right in front of my. Oh, please kindly introduce yourself.
Assalamualaikum, good morning. Mustafa, thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
I have a simple question. Is political Islam even necessary? If we're talking about the core values of justice, equality, egalitarianism, why do we need to articulate it in an Islamic way when most people cannot stand for it if they're not Muslim? So is it even necessary in the first place if you're fighting for justice, equality, and egalitarianism?
Thank you. Good point.
This will be the last one.
Good afternoon, sir.
It's not all wet.
My name is Sugason. I'm a student from Thye College Banjaya. The Malaysia Islamic Development Department, JAKIM, decided in July 2016 they banned liberalism, claiming that the ideology is deviant from religious teaching. The National Fatwa Council decided that liberalism is deviant. So when you trust in liberal Islam, you believe in it, how can you incorporate liberalism and Islam and apply it to Malaysia? How do we convince these people that liberalism is not a threat to religion? Thank you.
Thank you. So I learned that I'm a deviant.
Good deviants or bad
Thank you. Very, very informed and well thought questions. Let me begin with the Sharia Council issue. Of course, Sharia courts should not be given the authority to give verdicts that would violate human rights. I mean, if the Sharia court gives a verdict, says, yeah, of course you go stone your wife or something, that should be not in line with the legal framework of the UK and the universal human rights behind that. So there is a thin line there, I admit that. But also, so that's the red line. But beyond that, some communities tend to follow certain teachings that are not very liberal, that are more traditional than egalitarian. And if they opt for that, unless there's a serious human rights violation, I think we have to respect that will as well. We see this for Orthodox Jews. The Amish in the UK, in the US, they live in very medieval way of life. And their community, there should not be human rights violations in that, that's important. There should be a way to get out of that community, that's important. But how to deal with illiberal traditions within liberal societies is a great conceptual issue. And I am in favor of allowing people to follow certain traditions that make sense to them, even if it doesn't make sense to us, for the general society. Again, I would not be comfortable though if it justifies domestic violence or if it justifies any other form of violence or human rights violations. Is that a question to your answer? So there should be a concern about this. But to say we're banning these things will also say that to be a member of the liberal pluralistic society, you have to maybe give up some of your persuasions. I think that's also not a great way, the French way, let's say. To be a good citizen, you have to be laïcité in, the embodiment of it. Like, you should even eat pork or something like that kind of very... so that is the other extreme. And I'm in favor of more multicultural British traditional approach, which is, I think, more liberal by nature. But I see the point there. So it's a matter. So if the Sharia Council advises domestic violence, or violence against children or anything, the state should intervene in that case. So, but that's a good point. Thank you for pointing that out. Is political Islam necessary? Well, people want it, so it's necessary. The question is, how do we articulate it? I even believe in political Islam. For me, it's the defense of liberalism, because I think God gave humans rights, and when I'm defending those rights, I have a sense that I'm serving some divine value. So in that sense, to say that Islam should have nothing to do with politics, you can say that, but believers will be inspired from their religion, and that is not generally that's not always a problem. We actually see in the modern world political movements inspired by religion and really contributed to their societies. The civil rights movement in the US, Martin Luther King, he was a priest. He was a pastor. I mean, he was a clerk. He was a believer, a man of religion. He defended the equality of blacks and whites, saying God created us, we are God's children. So that was political Christianity, if you will, but in a good form. It was not the political Christianity of the Inquisition, which had the torture machines, for sure. It was a much more enlightened, freedom-serving kind of understanding. So if political Islam becomes something like that, I think it should not be a problem. It should actually be nourished, because also, let's not forget, you need certain values to stand up against authoritarianism, stand up against tyranny. And those values can well come from religion, and actually it's a contribution in that sense to society. Let's not forget that, for example, in communist Poland, the Catholic Church played an important role towards the end of communism, and its role, helped bring end to the Black Curtain, the Iron Curtain in Europe. So in that sense, we should not, I think, deprive religions, Islam or any other religion, to have a moral saying in public on political matters. But that saying should be based on justice, equality, tolerance, freedom, and against injustice. So if political Islam is standing up against injustice, I'm all up for it, and I'll be a part of it. The problem is that political Islam has gone through a very authoritarian lens. We want Shari'a, we want to stone you and cut your hand, that sort of thing. That's the main problem we have today. Jakim defined liberals like me as deviants. Well, it's their freedom of speech, I respect that. The thing is, there are so many deviances, in our Muslim world. Democracy was a deviancy for a long time. I mean, there are still people who tell you democracy is kufr. Voting is kufr, deviancy. They will tell you Prophet Muhammad never voted. Well, he didn't use cell phones either, but he used. They will say Prophet Muhammad never protested, never had a political protest with his, with a sign in his hand. Yeah, he did many other things or not good things that we do today, because he lived in his time and concept. We're living in a different time. So probably the people who see liberalism as deviancy think it like that. Religion teaches us that we have many obligations. We should fast in Ramadan. We should not drink alcohol. We should not have adultery. We should not gamble. Islam has many regulations, like Judaism, to some extent Christianity. And liberalism says everything is free. So if you're a liberal, you will be drinking every night, and you will go to brothels, and you will be doing everything that Islam bans. In Ramadan, you will just eat kebabs from morning to night. No, liberalism just means that you will follow Islam based on your own persuasion, out of your own will to worship God. In Ramadan, I block my freedom to eat during the day. But not because the government is telling me. It's because I want to do that. I choose to not to eat. That is liberalism. So liberalism gives us the basis to be Muslims in the way we understand, in the way we can. Sometimes people cannot fast. There's a verse in the Quran. It says if you're sick, if it is too much for you, don't fast. But if the government finds you not your fasting, the government will, jail you or something in some countries. ISIS kills people for that. They crucify people because they were not eating. They were eating in Ramadan. Maybe the people were sick and they were using their God-given license not to fast. So in that sense, liberalism gives us the basis to be sincere Muslims. I want liberalism for that. Some people will not be Muslims, some people will not be pious. Well, I can't control them. It's between them and God. I can advise them. Liberalism gives us the right to evangelize and spread our faith and to advise other Muslims and non-Muslims as well. So that's why liberalism is not a deviancy. And if you have friends at Jakim, you can maybe share this idea with them. I hope they will listen.
The next question.
Hi, my name is Natasha from Sunway University. In my humble opinion, I think political Islam is necessary because whether it's for fighting off the IS or to help the women and the marginalized groups in the Arab Spring, because Western democracy cannot do anything in that area, and only a true Islam in its own right, as in your interpretation or the true interpretation, can help that. So I guess the impediment is that people don't understand Islam, and that's because of all the defamation laws and the protections that we have for so long bestowed upon, put upon Islam. So people would not be able to assess and to really see Islam. Do you think, in that scenario, if you are to be political and help those people, do you think defamation law should be lifted, and indeed we should encourage people to really see Islam?
Thank you.
Defamation law in the sense of, is that a Malaysian concept?
In a lot of countries, I can't exactly name them, but basically people refrain from talking about Islam because they're afraid of criticizing Islam.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Wu, and good morning, Mr. Mustafa. My name is Elwin, I'm from Subang Jaya. The question that I'd like to pose to you, we have a very long established political party in Malaysia here who champion Islam as a political tool. So there are two parts of my question is, do you think that that is fall directly under politics Islam or just pure politics? Then the other thing, the same party who of late tried to introduce hudud law in Malaysia.
Which party is that?
PAS.
PAS.
You try to introduce hudud law in Malaysia and create a law hoo-ha in its own state and also on the federal constitution. So I want to seek your opinion whether that is actually a right way of politics Islam or just a politics per se. Then the other question is, we know about ISIS who have been creating a lot of havoc in the world. Do you think ISIS struggle is also under political Islam?
ISIS is under the banner, the category of political Islam?
Is it for a category or they are something special? Thank you.
Please pass your mic over to the left. Here.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
So this will be the last question for this batch.
I'm Stephen. I'm a politician. I'm from the party which the Islamic Party labeled last week as Kufar.
Oh, okay, you're not the best.
Yeah, I'm not from party. But I appreciate your observation about Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, because a few months ago my colleagues and I were in Tunisia and we visited him, and I was personally impressed by his articulation of Islam. But one observation I would like to point out is, after the November 2015 terrorist attack on the presidential entourage, Rashid Ghannouchi actually issued a statement. And the first thing that caught my mind on that statement is not because he condemned the attack, but because he did not cite any Quranic verses. Being a politician in Malaysia, I felt that a lot of times, at least here in Malaysia, or maybe let me talk about Ghannouchi. His statement, he has this confidence that whatever values that he is condoning, he is proposing against terrorist attack, universal values, are actually in line with Islam. So much so that he did not need to cite Quranic verses. But here in Malaysia, I feel that there is a gap, or rather, Muslims or politicians felt that there's always a need to verify or justify universal values with Quranic values. So can you maybe comment on this gap of Islam against universal values?
May I add one more thing?
Sure.
You have told us about political Islam in Tunisia, in Egypt, and the political Islam in Iraq and Syria. How about political Islam in Turkey that succeeded authoritarian secularism? And it is clearly also something in evolution. So it is committing deviancy at the same time, especially in its reaction to the Gulenist intrusion. So I would like you to...
Yeah, you'll make me a deviant in Turkey too. Thank you. Great questions, really, I love it. Let's keep this going on for hours, is it possible? Well, on the issue of defamation of Islam laws, I don't know the legal... Sorry? Is there laws about defamation of Islam in Malaysia?
No, I think she meant sedition.
Sedition.
No, so we also have the Sharia criminal offences law that makes it a crime to insult Islam. What insulting Islam means, heaven knows.
Now, this is a very thorny topic. I have a chapter on this in my book titled Freedom from Islam, which partly addresses this issue. And I don't know the Malaysian context in that well, so I'm not going to comment on it, but I can just say a few things. What Muslims should do when Islam is insulted? That's that general universal question. Well, I think the term insult should be, opened a little bit. I think in most societies, very gross, aggressive insults are generally seen as something illegal problem in every community. And you can see that in bans on anti-Semitism, for example. So from that standard, we can have some limitations on free speech. If someone comes out and says Islam is such a horrible religion, all the gross insults and Muslims are evil and so on and so forth, they are threats, and so, that kind of hate-mongering speech, very gross, that can be limited in the same logic that anti-Semitism, for example, in the West can be sometimes limited. However, also, there's the other problem that Muslims just sometimes consider any critique of Islam as an insult of Islam and try to ban it. Any joke or satire about Islam, they try to ban it. I'm not in favor of that. First of all, to ban critiques of Islam shows us intellectually weak. We cannot deal with criticism. Makes us intellectually weak because we don't face the criticism and have an argument against that. We just want to ban it. I said the other day, the first time I wanted to deal with Richard Dawkins when his book got published in Turkey some 15 years ago. He's an atheist thinker, I want to write something about that. And I found that all the good answers to Richard Dawkins came from British or American, like mainly Western Christian scholars who gave very reasoned arguments. In the Muslim world, he was just banned. So when you ban him, no problem, right? But actually when you ban him, the problem is still there. You just don't face it. So in that sense, this kind of offensive thought, which can be sometimes satire as well, I think should be tolerated legally, but should be countered, I think, intellectually. Plus, what about just mockery, like these cartoons, for example? I think they're not intellectual things, so we can deal with that. But should we ban them? Should we kill the cartoonists, you know, of Charlie Hebdo, for example? We shouldn't. And one thing is interesting. In the Quran, there is no verse about punishing or even silencing people who mock Islam. There's one verse in the Quran which is very clear about what to do about mockery of Islam. People who joke about Islam. It says, if you hear God's verses being mocked by a group of people, then do not sit with them unless they engage in a different discourse. It doesn't say go and kill them. It doesn't say go and behead them. It doesn't say even silence them. It says do not sit with those people. So if people are disrespectful to our religion, we can stop conversation with them. We can turn our face. We cannot buy their newspapers, and we can boycott them. But we don't have to go and, you know, try to wipe them off from the face of the earth. And when we try to do that, by the way, we are actually serving their argument, which generally is about that Islam is a violent religion. That's the whole argument, right? And Muslims go violent to protest against that. It's not a very good strategy either. So that's what I think about this whole defamation laws. So we can either accept some universal standards. No community should be demonized and targeted, neither Jews or Buddhists or Hindus or Muslims. We can't accept the universal standard on that. But other than that, I think we should be a bit more flexible about offensive thought. What about pas and hudud laws? Was that the question? Somebody else?
Yes.
Yes. Well, as I understand, there are different inclinations in PAS as well. There's a relatively more liberal-leaning wing, and there's a more conservative wing. Is that right? I don't know.
No more.
No more.
The so-called liberal wing has already been kicked out of PAS.
Yeah, sounds like Turkey. You know.
Stephen can elaborate more.
Sounds like AKP in Turkey. Well, they want hudud. That's the classical Islamic demand, right? We want hudud. And they think that when you bring hudud, hudud means the corporal punishments in Sharia. You want to chop hands and, you know, cut heads and flog people. And you think society will be wonderful. You know, every crime will vanish. Well, I mean, there's no statistical data to show that when you have very harsh punishments, actually crime disappears. Crime happens everywhere. There are countries like Sweden, which is very safe and stable and peaceful, but they don't have hudud. You know, so if you want to create an ideal society, they haven't achieved that with hudud. My take on hudud, which is generally corporal punishments in Sharia, it's a reformist interpretation. I ask the questions: why punishments in Sharia are generally corporal, about body? Why? Because all punishments were like that at that time in Libya. In 7th century Arabia, there were no prisons. In a tribal desert society, you don't have a prison made with brick walls and you put somebody inside and give him food every day, wait outside under the sun, you starving and you're just feeding the guy in there. It'll be better than everywhere else. Shade and bricks walls, and that's palace. There was no institution of prison. Prisons developed as, you know, modern centralized states came. That's why the British common law is all about corporal punishments. You steal something, they flog you, they cut you, They torture you. Actually, much more stuff there going on, in medieval European laws. One thing was to put people, they would put the slightest hudud in the European style was to make men sit with their heads and feet, clapped in the middle of the city, and people were tortured. That was the classical way of punishing people. You either let them go or you do something physical. Otherwise, you can't deal with them for the next 20 years. So, I agree with Fazlur Rahman that we should understand these things not literally. We should understand them in their own context. And from them, we should understand certain things. That theft is a crime. It should have a reason. And by the way, the Ottoman Empire replaced hudud laws with prison punishments. So it was not something unheard of. In the Ottoman Empire, the corporal punishments on hudud was made like the ultimate limit, but then many other fine gradations were brought. If you're still something, you'd go to prison for 5 days, 20 days, 100 days, depending on what you stole. So it could be balanced. So we had that flexibility, and therefore I think the obsession with hudud is not, I think, coherent in my view. So to PAS, we can, have that argument. I don't know if they will agree, but since the liberals are kicked out from PAS, I don't know. Maybe they'll have a new movement. We'll have these. Let's to ISIS category. Which category ISIS falls into? I should have done a better job in terms of categorizing Islamist movements. For me, there is first political Islam, which is not violent. Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Salvation Front, Algeria, other Muslim Brotherhoods in Jordan, Hamas maybe, but Hamas is armed. We'll come to that in a second. So there's political Islam. This is non-violent. These are the people who want to come to. PAS is certainly in that political Islam. And in the liberal edge of political Islam, there's Nahda, which is, I think, going towards a growingly different direction, which is a good one. Then, when political Islam ends, another category begins that is called jihadism in general. These are generally political Islamists who use weapons. They say, we want to come to power, we want Islamic states, but we can't bother with this nonsense called democracy and elections. We will do it by weapons. Or they are also using weapons, they're using guns, because they are resisting an occupation in the Hamas or Hezbollah case. Other cases in Southeast Asia, they are Islamists in arms. And by the way, the suppression of political Islamists pushes people to the armed jihadi direction sometimes, as Algeria experienced in 1991 after a brutal coup against elected Islamists. You had the jihadists, proliferating because the political Islam was suppressed. And Al-Qaeda, by the way, after the coup against Morsi, released a message saying to Muslim Brotherhood, you see, we told you democracy is nonsense. You should join us. Get into arms. So coups against elected Islamists is not a good idea. Within the jihadists, which is the more worrying category, there are more moderate, reasonable jihadists in my view, and I would put Hamas, Hezbollah there, which basically fight to save a occupied territory, and which, at least at times, have emphasized that they don't attack civilians. Some people in the Palestinian resistance attack Israeli civilians, and I condemn those attacks as terrorism. But for example, Hamas and Hezbollah both condemn the Paris attacks by ISIS, saying that you can't attack innocent civilians. Because when you launch jihad, in classical jihad category, you can fight soldiers, you cannot fight civilians, you cannot attack civilians. That's a classical Islamic jurisprudential fact. So in that sense, there are, among the jihadis, there are more reasonable ones. They're armed, but they have a cause. They're like Marxist guerrillas or something. Then, besides them, there are the more fanatic jihadists, and Al-Qaeda is the best example there, which justifies attacks on civilians as well, which was a deviation that took place in the 80s. Then there's ISIS, which is the craziest of the the most fanatic wing. I compare ISIS to Khmer Rouge in the Marxist, spectrum. In the 70s, there were Marxists. Some were the democratic Marxists, come to power with democracy, socialists. Then there were Leninist, revolutionary Marxists, the jihadi, types. Then there was the Khmer Rouge, who was so bloody that it was too fanatic for even, other Marxists, like the Vietnamese Marxists found, Khmer Rouge too much. So in that sense, ISIS is, I think, the Khmer Rouge of the spectrum. I hope that won't be worse, and I think ISIS will disappear anytime soon. But that's how I define ISIS. So in that sense, I'm not saying ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. I'm saying ISIS is the most fanatic expression of political Islam, actually jihadism, that we have seen so far. And I think its human rights violations are so gross and so horrible. And as a Muslim, I'm grossed out by all of that, and I'm totally against that. And I'm sure every Muslim I know feels that way. But they are still doing this under the banner of Islam, although it's a very distorted interpretation. We should see that fact. By saying they have nothing to do with it, we're not, I think, seeing the reality there. There was Khawarij in our medieval era, which was similarly slaughtering all other Muslims, calling them apostates. They had something to do with Islam. They were the ultimate fanatics of Islam. Like the Crusaders or the Inquisitors had something to do with Christianity. Okay, Ghanouchi. Why did Ghanouchi quote a verse or not quote?
No, he didn't.
He didn't quote a verse.
There's a confidence that Quranic values are actually in sync with universal values.
Well, there is no. It's okay. He didn't quote a verse. He could have quoted a verse, and there is nothing wrong with quoting verses from the Quran to make political statements. You can quote a verse from the Quran to emphasize the parallelism between universal values and Islamic values. Bill Clinton quoted verses from the Quran, and I was happy to see that way back. I think he quoted a verse about God created humans into different nations and tribes so we can meet each other. So he quoted in one of his speeches way back in the 90s, and he said, that's great, this pluralism that, So in that sense, if you look at Quran and if you find there these universal values, as we call them, that's not a problem. That's a great thing, and to bridge them. So we don't have to always speak in the secular language. We can, of course, speak within the religious language, but what do we derive from there as well? I've seen Ghanouchi quoting the Quran in certain cases, so he didn't quote, it's okay. But of course, we don't have to always refer to religion, because religion and revelation and reason are the two sources of truth, in my view, as the Mu'tazila defended in the Middle Ages, and also Maturidi school in Sunni Islam, because we can establish things by injustice is wrong. We can establish by reason as well. But our tradition says it as well. So two of them together, and that togetherness is a good thing to, I think, underline. Political Islam in Turkey, and how's it going? Well, Turkey is a special case, and I was more optimistic about Turkey's direction when I wrote this book in 2011. In Turkey, actually, this evolution of political Islam into a more liberal future, as I hope from Nahta these days, I had seen that light in Turkey with the AKP, Justice and Development Party. I am less, optimistic these days and more critical. Not because AKP wants to bring hudud or impose Shari'a. These are not discussions in Turkey. But just the AKP lost the liberal reformist mission it's claimed in its earlier years. It gradually became intolerant to criticism, more authoritarian. It was a party of different thinkers and different voices. It became the party of just one man, the president today. And total obedience to him is the code in the party. The more liberal-leaning, gentle voices, such as the very founder of the party, Abdullah Gül, have been pushed aside. So I see a growingly illiberal, authoritarian tendency in the AKP. I'm not happy to see that. Is this coming from political Islam? There's an element of that, but there's a kind of Putinistic element as well, which is not an Islamic problem, as you know. Putin is not a Salafi, but he's kind of, he loves power and he loves to dominate society. So there's a little bit of the tendency as well, which made me really unhappy. And that's the other thing. The authoritarianism problem in the Islamic world is not always coming from interpretations of Islam. It is coming from rulers who don't want to be criticized, rulers who don't want to be questioned on their corruption or nepotism. They can use Islam sometimes to justify their, not so just ways of ruling. And in that sense, we see that kind of evolution in Turkey. Unfortunately, Turkey generally has a nice decade, then after that we get crazy and have a drama for another decade, and then we have a reform again, so it just goes a step forward and 2 steps back. That's the kind of evolution in Turkey. We should also see, though, that the political problems in Turkey have been worsened by the Syrian civil war, by the dangerous neighborhood we're in, actually. Iraq, Syria, Iran, so these are our neighbors, and the dramas there also affected Turkish political scene, poisoned Turkish political scene as well. And I hope Turkey will progress forward. It's still I think one of the most important countries in the Muslim world. It's my country, and I think we still have an important tradition of democracy. It's just not in its best time these days. And the Gülen movement, AKP struggle you mentioned, is a power struggle among the winners of New Turkey. Turkey was dominated by a more secular elite for many decades, which was very authoritarian, which banned the headscarf in universities, things like that. The Gülen movement, which is a civil society group which has members in the bureaucracy, and the AKP were allies against it. But once they defeated the old guard, like the Afghan Mujahideen who defeated the Red Army but then got into a civil war for many years, they just got into a bitter political fight, at the end of which Gülen movement is now the victim and the loser. And I think they are going through some injustice in that sense. But they have also, they should have been wiser not into getting into a political fight and have stayed as a civil society movement, not as a actor in such a strong actor in bureaucracy. Does that answer the question?
Well, very good. You had said that apostasy is something of personal choice. How about the Kurds who wish to have greater political autonomy within Turkey? What should be political Islam's response
to that?
Separatism?
I have a book on that, unfortunately in Turkish.
But let's take more questions and you can
okay, good.
The answer.
Sure.
You have one. And then, Marie, question form. Then Marie, you pass for the Marie, please. Yeah. Oh, please.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Omer.
Where are you from, Omer?
I'm from Macedonia.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I've heard political Islamists make these 2 reconciliatory points between political Islam and democracy. Firstly, they say, given that democracy is based on the rule of majority, why is it wrong for us to enact some laws which the majority of people want them, right? Even if it is like some more extreme laws, which some people seem actually some people might deem to be extreme. And the second one is that they say, given that what is right and what is wrong, what is extreme, what is not extreme, is always debatable. Why do we have to follow specific norms, specific rules from other societies in our societies, which probably are not the same, right? And most of the time they state the death penalty in the United States. They say the United States is democracy, but then still they have the harsh death punishment. I think these are the 2 most common reconciliatory points. But then even Rashid Ghanouchi, which you support so much, recently was asked by Mehdi Hasan whether he would support the stoning if the majority of people wanted it. He did not respond. He didn't have an answer to it. He said, he didn't want to answer it. So I'm afraid if he were to come to power, that would actually happen if he thought the majority of people wanted it. So how do you how do you deal with these 2 points?
So, the imposition of norms and stoning. And Rashid Ghanouchi's take on that. Yeah, okay, got it.
The last question, Marina. Oh, someone else too?
No. Just going back to the what you were saying about how to respond to so-called insults to Islam or insults to Muslims, and that you said that such offensive thought should be tolerated legally but countered intellectually, which I completely agree. But that assumes that there are intellectuals to counter that. In a lot of Muslim countries, the level of education is so poor. I mean, the so-called Islamic Republic of Pakistan only has a literacy rate of 58%. I think that's part of the problem, or of the problems that Muslim countries have. But also, it means that the capacity to respond in a reasoned, intellectual way is simply not there. And that probably relates to this question, because people want hudud because they're unable to think, intellectually about what is the actual impact of that, because they are simply not educated. So.
Thank you so much.
We have actually 2 more questions. This is a country of strong women, so you have these 2 as exemplified by Prime Minister's wife.
This is Bahar Dogan from Turkish Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. Welcome, Mr. Mustafa Akyol. Nice to see you here. It's been a pleasure to hear your speech.
Great. Can you put the microphone? Yeah, close.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
And it was very enlightening for me as a Turkish person. And it's very rare to have, Turkish lecturers, thinkers here in Malaysia. And thank you very much for those.
That's why I plan to come every month.
We will be very pleased to see you here.
You'll get the embassy to sponsor it.
Yeah, make a business class flight.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for hosting.
Yes, get your question, ma'am.
About Turkey's experience during the last 16 years or 20 years, 2 decades, and especially with regards to the EU accession process. There has been many reform packages implemented. And lastly, in 2013, there was another democratization package which was implemented for the rights of Kurdish population in Turkey, and also lifting the ban for hijab in universities, and after that it was also lifted for the public sector for women who would like to wear hijab. And after the elections also, the government announced another democratization package, which was for the strengthening of individual rights and freedoms in Turkey. And the government is very much committed
to your question, please.
I just would like to have a contribution first, and then I will have my question if you...
Because...
Sorry for taking your time, but I have to say, these things. And the most important part in this reform process is the EU accession, EU membership target that Turkey had for many years. It was a strategic choice, strategic target for Turkey, and it's an ongoing process. It's a dynamic process that we have in Turkey, and our party and the government has changed many things in Turkey, in political arena of Turkey. In the past, we had a more rigid secularism, as it was, inspired by the French system, laïcité. But now we have more reconciled, normalized secularism in Turkey for different segments of the society. And as for the Gülen movement, it's much more complicated, to be honest, for my personal opinion. We are, talking about a structure which were infiltrated in the state bureaucracy and different organs of the government, and you don't know what are their interests. I mean, they are they have the every right to exist as an NGO, civil society movement, religious group, yes, but if they infiltrate in the state bureaucracy and if they would like to change the decision-making process, and how we can talk about, you know, a liberal democracy? Is it a room? Does it have a room in a democracy? This kind of structure. This is my question to everybody. And my question, the real question, is that especially in the Western world, Western media, there is a discussion, ongoing discussion about reformation, the need for reformation. It was in Christianity. Do we need that in Islam? Because as far as I know, the message of many religions are the same. But the history and institutions and the evolution of religions are very much different. So can we compare Christianity and Islam in that sense? Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot of questions. Should we maybe?
One last question.
Okay, sure.
And then we'll close.
Okay, the lady should have the last.
Sure.
I have a simple question. There is an analysis going on that leaders, I think Muslim leaders in Muslim countries, seem to think of themselves as modern pharaohs. And therefore, they cannot be replaced nor be questioned. Do you agree? And if you do, why has it evolved this way? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have some very difficult questions.
Yes.
And we look forward to your answers.
Very great questions. Let's start with the Kurds in Turkey, on which I've written a book on 2006, Rethinking the Kurdish Question, What Went Wrong, What Next. Unfortunately, it's just available in Turkish, but that's an issue that I've been following. Let me say this, the Turkish Republic has been very unfair to Kurds from the very beginning. Kurdish language was banned, an unbelievable thing, I think, seen very rarely in the modern world. It was illegal to speak Kurdish, like even on the street. Kurdish culture was erased, the names of Kurdish towns have been Turkified, because we had this very assimilative nationalism which hoped to create a coherent nation, not based on pluralism, but based on unity, and by Turkifying every non-Turkish group. Bulgaria tried a similar thing with the Turks of Bulgaria in the Živkov era in the 80s, and we strongly reacted to that. They tried to Bulgaria-fy the Turks, banned the Turkish language, and so on and so forth. So it's a madness that's going on in that part of the world. It's not just Turkey. It's a post-Ottoman nationalistic trauma that haunted the region. And sometimes Turks in Greece face similar problems. They're called Hellenes of the Muslim faith. They're not allowed to call themselves Turks, because if they call themselves Turks, they won't be Greeks enough. So it's a regional problem. But speaking of Turkey, Turkey has been very, very, very authoritarian on that. However, this has changed. First of all, this had reactions. This led to several revolts against the Republic. The insurgency by the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, illegal armed group, is the latest of these, reactions, and it's a civil war, quasi-civil war, terrorist campaign, whatever you call it, that's going on since 1984 and still haunting the cities in Turkey's southeast today. Now, however, as rightly pointed out, Turkey gradually realized its own madness on this issue, and certain reforms have taken place. Thanks to Turgut Özal, who's my hero of the 20th century Turkish politics. First, the bans on Kurdish culture were gradually lifted. The AKP, the current government, did a good job in this area for sure. In the AKP era, gradually, a lot of bans on Kurdish culture have been eliminated. Even now you have, with the 2013 reforms and other reforms before that, now you have Kurdish language in Turkish schools as elective classes. You have a Turkish state TV which broadcasts in Kurdish. So to say I'm a Kurd and I'm proud of that became possible in Turkey, which is a great thing, which should be in the beginning, but it was an achievement for us. And I've been the defender of that liberation of Kurds, like as in other minorities. But does this mean Kurds also should have an autonomy, political autonomy, in Turkey's certain regions? Well, certainly they can want that, and we can discuss that. And then if there is a democratic process for that, we can have a referendum and there can be some autonomy. I'm certainly not against that. I'm not even against an independent Kurdistan. If they want it, if everybody wants it in certain cities, let them be happy, You can't force people to be in a country. Scotland voted to be remaining in the UK or not. Well, more Scots said we'll be in, and they stayed, but they could have become independent. However, it is not that easy to define what that Kurdistan region will be, either as autonomy or independent, because unlike in Iraq and Syria, Kurds are actually scattered all of Turkey. Istanbul is the biggest Kurdish city today. And in the southeast, you go to a place like Mardin, one village is more Kurdish, the other village is more Turkish, so it's very ethnically mixed. So it's not there's no clear boundary of a Kurdistan. That's one thing which makes things difficult. Secondly, the bigger problem is that the PKK declared autonomy without any democratic process. They said, we establish autonomy in these regions. And they established autonomy by having their armed men in the city, creating barricades, and saying, we are now ruling this area. However, the PKK has some support from the Kurds, but not all the Kurds. There are many Kurds who are actually afraid of the PKK, because PKK is a political party, a Marxist group. Not every Kurd supports it. That's why AKP gets a lot of vote from the Kurdish areas as well. So in that sense, I think today Turkey's struggle against the PKK is basically justified. However, Turkish government has to be very careful and very transparent about human rights abuses, about civilian casualties that is going on in this conflict, and not demonize the liberals, leftists in the country which criticize the government on this issue. So in that sense, I'm critical of the government's authoritarianism regarding a free discussion on this issue. But regarding the PKK, I think it is legitimate for the government not to accept that the PKK can just declare autonomy and take a part of the city as they're under their control with armed presence and tax the people and who don't want to be taxed by them, like food courts, people's courts, and so on and so forth. So that's what I think about that. Ultimately, how Turkey will solve this question, I supported the peace process between the government and the PKK. I hope it will be revitalized again. I would like to see like an IRA British deal. We were getting close to that. It failed, partly because of the civil war in Syria. And I think ultimately that's the way out. But right now, a conflict is going on between the PKK and the government. And that's sad. And there are civilian casualties as well, by both sides, probably as collateral damage, because the conflict is going on right within the cities. Certain parts of Diyarbakir, Şırnak, and certain Hakkari, certain provinces in the southeast. Is that an answer to the question? Sure. Which actually makes me jump to that question, and I'll come to the others. Did the AKP government do all these great reforms? Yes, they did. That's why I supported AKP. Until 2013, as you said very nicely. They had the great liberal package, the last one in 2003. And still, generally the AKP has been very good on Kurdish rights and the rights of conservative Muslims, such as wearing a headscarf. This is great. These are great gains for Turkey. But these are also the issues that don't conflict with their Islamic worldview. Kurdish language is just fine from an Islamic country. God created different languages. Why would it be a problem? They're not that liberal when it comes to the Alevis, an unorthodox, non-Sunni sect in Turkey. For some reason, the Alevi demands for equality with Sunnis has never been realized by the AKP government. They're not that great when it comes to secular life. People have alcohol festivals and stuff like that. So I see the contributions of AKP to Turkish democracy, but I also see the shortcoming there. And I think gradually, especially in the past few years, they're advancing only the issues that do not conflict with their own worldview. But when I think Turkish society needs more reforms, and some of those reforms would force the AKP to go beyond its own ideological background, but they are not doing that enough, especially with the Alevis. I think you can see the problem there. And the other thing, AKP did great reforms until 2013, but right after that, they started undoing some of those reforms. And the EU documented this very well. They have started undoing some of the justice reforms they have done regarding the independence of the judiciary. It has been curbed back, and EU documented this. Turkey is going back from the reforms that it did under the AKP. And when you look at, for example, today, the demonization of some 1,000 academics who signed a biased petition too, in my view, more only against the government but nothing saying against the PKK, which is a biased view, but biased views are free too in a free society. You see the old authoritarianism surfacing again, the very authoritarianism AKP criticized before. So that's why I liken to AKP to the Ibn Khaldunian cycle. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Ibn Khaldun, medieval great historian, said that he had a cyclical view of history. He observed that there are cities and deserts. The conquerors from the desert come and take the cities, but gradually they become like the city people. Then new people come, So AKP is just turning into the establishment that it used to criticize. That's why, maybe we need a new wave of change in Turkish politics, and I doubt it will come from the AKP. If it comes again, I'll be happily supporting it. On the Gülen movement, yes, the presence of a religious group as a hierarchy in itself in bureaucracy is unacceptable. And Gülen movement is legitimate in civil society, but not, and they can have members in the bureaucracy as individuals, but not as a close-knit, group. But it is the AKP who brought them there. Against the common enemy of the secular generals. And when the alliance crumbled, the Gülen movement exposed some of the wrongdoings of the AKP side, big issues of corruption, and AKP demonized them as Zionist spies. I think the more fair thing to do was said, here you have two allies, both did some wrong things, and then fought each other and exposed each other's mistakes, and that's why I take a more balanced and fair position regarding that. And today I think the government has the right to take some of the wrongdoings of members of the Gülen movement in the bureaucracy to court, like some fake document against generals and so on and so forth. These are, I think, legitimate issues. But the government doesn't have the right to close down the kindergartens of Gülen movement and confiscate their companies and just a whole war in civil society. I think that is against the law, that is against justice, and that's wrong, ultimately. So, as you see, Turkey is a very complicated country, so I'm not going to bore you with all its different details. Does Islam need a reformation? Actually, I argued against that argument a couple of times. We need to reform our understanding of Islam. We need to reform and reinterpret Islamic law. But we don't need what exactly Martin Luther did in the 16th century. Because Martin Luther basically said the Catholic Church cannot dominate Christianity. We don't have a Catholic Church. We don't have a Pope. We actually are very Protestant in the sense that there is no center in Islam. There is no Pope, there is no papacy, there is no central authority. So we don't have the exact same problem. That's why I wrote, we don't need a Martin Luther, we need a John Locke. John Locke being the father of modern liberal thinking. So we need more liberalism in Islamic thought, not the exact reformation of Martin Luther. But for that liberalism, we need to revisit and reform Islamic law, and even culture, I should say. It's not a Lutheran thing, but it's a reinterpretive, I think, effort on Islam. And if you want to compare Islam to any other religion, always go for Judaism rather than Christianity. I think that's a more relevant parallel. There was some, intellectuals and their capacity. What about, do we have the intellectuals to face the challenges that is coming to Islam? I actually got this very good observation, by the way, and I agree with you. I also heard from, for example, from one of Turkey's Islamic scholars. I was arguing that in Turkey, Christian missionaries should be free, to distribute Bibles and to say what they would say. And he was saying, but these Christian missionaries are so informed. We don't know anything to counter them. And I said, so we will forever stay uninformed? If you want a child to swim, you should sometimes push him to the water. The thing is, by not countering intellectual challenges by intellectual responses, we are dooming ourselves to stay like that. We ban things and we're saying that's great. I mean, don't put any confusing books to Bahasa Malaysia? Yeah. Is that right? Malay language? Bahasa. So people who, in that language will not be confused. Yes, they won't be confused forever. They will not know much about all these disturbing ideas. But then why would they need to learn new things? Why would they develop themselves? Intellectual challenges are a recipe for intellectual maturation, if you take them. So, and we have money. We have a lot of oil-rich, Muslim states. Instead of, using that money for, I don't know, spreading just mosque with a certain narrow understanding of Islam, why don't they create these great institutions like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad 1,000 years ago, where a lot of Muslim scholars will sit down and, have debates on the origin of species and all of that. We'll be able to read them in the first place because they won't be banned. And so let's put effort into that. And if we don't, we will always stay, in that sense, intellectually. So I see the challenge there, but I think we should see that challenge as an opportunity for development. Because when you don't face a challenge, you just stay the same. Muslim thought had a very creative era because they faced the Greek philosophy challenge. When they read Aristotle, Muslim thinkers said, wow, this is amazing, but what do we say against this as Muslims? What do we say about that? Some, made interpretations of Aristotle, some became total Aristotelians, a few became total seculars, but others actually created an Islamic interpretation of Aristotle, which was then seen as science. Al-Kindi, was a great philosopher who built a philosophy because he read Aristotle, and based on that he just read an Islamic counter-argument. Not a counter-argument, an interpretation of Aristotle. So in that sense, we will start to develop when we start to take the challenge. I think that's... and the states should put their effort into that rather than banning websites and, banning books. Would you agree? I don't know.
Can I just supplementary thing? Don't you think that part of the Islamic authoritarian political project is to keep their people dumb?
Yeah, of course. Now,
and then, and then seeing the fruits of that and not being able to counter it, it's a contradiction.
You're right. Of course, my argument is based on the presupposition that we need to open up and intellectually mature. Yeah. Not everybody shares that presupposition. For some other people, the way things are good, let's just preserve it in the way they are, so that we will also continue our status quo, if they're happy with the status quo. If you are a member of the royal family in Saudi Arabia, the world is perfect. Great, wonderful. Why would you need to change things? Change is dangerous. So in that sense, yes, the elites should have an important role here. And that's why we should call on the elites, at least, or to criticize them when they actually take the role of blockers of free thought, because free thought doesn't serve them. Very good point. I don't know how things are in Malaysia, so I'm not going to comment on that. I'm sure you have beautiful, wonderful elites which all want to open up minds, and I want to see that. Finally, was there modern pharaohs? Great question, great analogy. And it shows the problem. Was the Pharaoh an Islamist? The Pharaoh was a despot. There are so many despots in the history of the Middle Eastern geography. They were not despots because they're Muslim. They were not despots because they were reading the Quran or the Hadith. They were despots. That kind of what some Orientalists call Oriental despotism, which sometimes took a really biased view, but it has some truth. Partly because of geography, topography. The Middle East has always been a land of very centralized authoritarian states. Whereas in the UK, you had a chance to go to Magna Carta. Feudalism helped actually evolution of democracy. Whereas in the States, you had all these very despotic empires. And the heritage of that lives today in the legacy of Bashar Assad or Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, before him Mubarak, and so on and so forth. And Islam sometimes becomes a victim of these people, sometimes becomes the tools of these people. So the authoritarianism is already there, it just took an Islamic garb. And I'm calling to put that authoritarianism to side and re-understand Islam in a more liberal framework. The authoritarianism we see, which sometimes uses religion, is something ugly and something different. It comes from the pharaohs, exactly. But we should not let the pharaohs define Islam. Or we should not follow the Islam defined by a certain pharaoh, like Umayyad dynasty in the 1st century of Islam, saying that, oh yeah, this was the Sahih interpretation because it was chosen that way because it helped the ruler at the time. So making that distinction is very important. And yes, the idea that you should obey the ruler, you should not criticize the ruler knows everything. This is not an Islamic teaching. It's just an authoritarian teaching.
Thank you so much. Today's talk is the outcome of cooperation among 3 groups: the Jeffrey Chia Institute at Sunway University, the Group of 25, and the Islamic Renaissance Front. So I would like now to invite Dr. Farouk Musa to present our enlightening speaker with a small memento of Sunway University.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you all for spending 2 hours.